Well, that may be fine for a machine, but it certainly doesn't work for living systems. And I think that's where we start getting into some of our problems in terms of living systems, that there can be growth and development and then evolution. Nature, and particularly the biosphere or living systems, have an ability to sustain themselves and to grow still within an infinite world. That's through diversity and complexity. Yeah. So gradually in the 1920s,
the ecology, and on that front, it's been thought that what we really need to have a healthy ecology is to set aside more land just for nature to do its own thing without us interfering. So, and there is no such thing as a hard stop. You can't define when the world will run out of something or when something will go wrong in an ecology and it collapses. So how do you really regard this, do you think? If you want to think non-linearly, there's still a limit there, but what is it?
Well, you have to start talking about the whole concept of systems in terms of a living system or chemical system, but particularly we're dealing with, as far as sustainability, living systems, and that includes us and all the things that walk around or maybe salient beings that are on the planet and their sustainability. And nature seems to have a formula for sustaining itself and sustaining an organism, whether it be animals or whether it be humans or whether it be micro species of any kind. And I think the element with a system is that we have to shift our thinking from linear to nonlinear or circular. And we have to go from the objects that we talk about when we have this thesis that we've lived with probably 300 years in one way or the other, and even more so in the last 110 years in terms of since the Industrial Revolution, of a view of the world as being a machine and an object to be measured and to be weighed.
Yeah, okay. Well, suppose we don't think of the world as a machine. Now, where are we?
Well, maybe you have to take a new perspective, and that's the perspective of systems thinking. We talked about ecology and biology, and certainly some parts of psychology were working on the concept that if a system is not the sum of its parts, and that's a living system seems to be that, represented by that. What is, well, when they say that a living system is more than the sum of its parts, the operative question I keep getting is, what is that more? And there's been the challenge started to say, what is life in terms of it? Yeah. What is, you have the people that have been involved with the mechanistic view of what the world, and then people that came along and started talking about the vitalists who start talking about the essence of something in there. In fact, they even had a formula that had to be added into the so-called linear formulas, which was called N. What is the N that's in there? N with the the little upside down S as was it
Tilde?
Yeah. And I guess the search for the N has started probably right after the challenge of relativity and quantum physics.
Yeah.
Well, the physicists have been working on this problem too.
Yeah, well, let's go on with it. Where does that leave us with this issue? And so, yeah, you don't know what the world can stand exactly. We've been co-opting more and more and more of it to feed more and more people. And the answer may or may not be more farm ground. It's, if you start looking for answers, you got to get pretty imaginative. We could change the composition of what we eat. We could give nature a little more share of it and still probably live okay. Then you got the complication of maybe the climate's changing, so you won't be able to grow what you always did where you always did. So you got to, you're into a lot of fast adaptation if the future unfolds the way environmentalists think it's going to.
Well, the problem is that we're still describing that world in a linear way, not a systemic way, because there are a lot of different characteristics of this systemic thinking in terms of it. One, that a system itself is not the sum of its parts, but it's the relationships of those parts.
Yeah, well, let's pursue that one a minute. About everybody I know that's sort of trying to do, a circular economy, local level, whatever, the social part of it is not clearly separated from the environmental. What excites them? How do we get out from under the heel of the system that keeps working against us or is discriminating against us or whatever it is? That gets people excited much more than an environmental issue.
Yeah, I think when you talk about living systems, you have to talk about human beings, animals, but also social systems are living systems. And they do operate very similar. Living systems basically are qualities and relationships. And those are things that cannot be easily measured in the terms of physics and chemistry. So how do you talk about them if they're not linear? You have to map them. You can't measure them, you can't weigh them, but they certainly are relationships and connections. So there's a new language that has to be put on there. And this has been going on for a while, and it's been in the 40s, they started developing cybernetics and theories of cybernetics, which were based on feedback. And they were basing it certainly not in terms of all kinds of mapping facilities. A model being like J. Forrester with stocks and flows, were used in terms to explain that, visibly explain it. So in my mind, you have to take the physics, classical physics and chemistry, and this linear approach, and build a synthesis to explain the other portions. You can't just do it by measuring it as an object.
Yeah, well,
you can't identify its behavior.
The human reaction to stocks and flows is wonderfully illustrated by the beer game, which a lot of people have played now. So yeah, the flow is affected by people's perception of the flow and their interest in it and so on. And usually as a result of the beer game, they come up with some insights how a system works that they didn't have before. And that thing's been around for 30, 40 years now. Uh,
Well,
let's go on to something else. You're talking about quality. The second one of these principles, or another one, is quality of life over quantity. Now, in that sense, what does quality mean? You were mentioning that quality is difficult to measure. Certainly, if it's quality of life, it's difficult to measure with numbers. So this is kind of a subjective thing. There are some easy things like, do you have enough to eat? Are you warm enough? And are your physical is your physical situation such that you can keep going? But beyond that, what's quality of life?
I think we're back. That's another lens to look at the fact that the quality of life, quality period, quality of life or quality is a relationship of satisfaction, is part of a living system, and it can't be weighed and measured like we try to do scientifically in classical physics
Or economics.
or economics.
You know,
Okay.
so quality of life is not necessarily measured by GNP per capita, or even if you break that down to income per person.
Well, you can't let the linear approach dominate the nonlinear aspect of reality.
Mm.
Whether, too much, you just said economics. The difficulty is we've allowed a linear approach to economics to dominate living systems
Well, maybe you could
instead of being
extend.
embedded in
Yeah, well,
living
maybe you
systems.
could extend that. If you look at a model of GNP, it's a great big flow diagram, money flow. But does that really measure things that are all that important?
Or does it describe the behavior of that system? It
Yeah,
doesn't.
yeah. It's there is no model. It's a perfect model. And the older economists never referred to it as the model. They always called it an indicator. Much smarter.
Well, I think it's smarter, but it's the easy way out of telling people that what we're saying is only a possibility, not a
Yeah,
reflection of reality.
this is something we can measure because of transactions. So it's an indicator. Don't put too much stock in it.
Yeah, take your umbrella out with you. At least the weathermen are honest. You have a six, you
Yeah,
know.
and
So
that leads to another one of these principles, which is measuring things physically or in some way other than strict numeracy. I'd put that as look at the performance. If you want to change a total system, look at the performance of a total system as best you can, rather than the parts, and rather than breaking down into fine detail the performance of each of the parts, hoping that something will somehow go together here. In other words, if you want to reduce energy, look at how much energy is used in a community or a watershed or whatever is of interest, rather than, well, here's an example. Here's somebody doing something. Well, okay, but what's everybody else doing? Or you got great fuel economy on a vehicle, but we tripled the number of vehicles. Did you really do anything?
yeah, but why is that?
Oh,
Because you designed the the answer to the problem in a linear measure without encompassing any of the qualities that had to be there. You can't take a system and to say you understand it, whether it's a car or a human being, outside just by looking at its internal parts and their relationship. The system is described and its behavior is described in how it reacts and lives in the real world, in the bigger system.
I certainly go along with that. And to that point, all of us, including me, like a good many of the comforts and conveniences and capabilities you can get out of a modern economy. What most of us don't like is paying the price if we live next to a fracking well or a quarry or something that makes a lot of noise, or having the roads beat up, or some toxic release happens, or oil gets in the river, or whatever it is.
Well, I think we don't accept responsibility for the fact, what can we learn from the environment? We have to learn how the environment sustains itself naturally, what its laws are, in order for us to survive inside of that. So we've taken to extreme the linear approach of thinking and mindset, and it doesn't necessarily answer all the problems.
Well, it can't answer all the problems, so let's move on. In nature, everything either absorbs sunlight energy from somewhere, or it eats something else that was once alive. When first thought about that, it's a fairly cruel system. Well, it is, but it's nature. It sort of takes a romantic view out of it, and we're a part of it. And so if we're going to live and let nature live, what do we need to do?
We have to learn more about how nature does it, how nature designs and adapts, because the environment, or if you want to call it, has responded to all kinds of external hazards and changes and lightning and floods and meteors, and does it pretty well.
Yeah, well, Sandra practices that to some degree in our little 0.03 acre backyard ranch, a garden. So rather than using too much artificial stuff, she tries to organize a balance of nature. You know, we got toads, and we got lizards and other little bug eaters, and you got birds that'll eat things. Sometimes they'll eat the tomatoes too, as long as they don't eat too many of them. And so that's working with nature by trying to help nature sustain a balance of the forces that keep it going.
I think there's inherent in every system. If we go back to the point of, and it's, the 6th point is always think holistically. There's a lot in that statement, and we don't clarify it long enough. And that's the fact, if you live in a system and you understand the characteristics of systems, their networks, systems, anything that exists in a system is interdependent with everything else in the system. You can't pull anything. You can't be pulled out of the earth or off the earth and not be attached to something else in terms of it. Certainly ecology started in the 1920s by giving us that insight that these relationships and organisms and community of organisms were really networks. And do we understand that network? The real insight that I always felt was important, that overlooked, was the fact that there are patterns of feedback. The one thing I came out of school with was a very strong interest in cybernetics, because feedback is the most important element of it. And certainly secondary cybernetics goes in even a little further into the human end of it, and the noise factor and the communication end of it. But what it started developing in the 40s right through to the 70s, when complexity theories were finally stabilized, is the fact that if you live in a system, we have to understand how systems work. And when you live and look at the patterns of how things behave as systems, these patterns are repeated a number of times in a number of different species and activities in the environment.
Well,
There's
they're
a
repeated,
balancing,
but
there
never.
are balancing feedback loops.
Yeah.
I mean, there are balancing feedback loops.
Well,
There are certainly
yeah,
reinforcing
they're,
feedback loops.
they're
There are
repeating,
probably,
but
yes,
they're
they're
never
probably,
exactly repeating because things are always changing. Even this little backyard garden is never quite the same one year to the next. You know, the moisture on it changes, what's there changes. And so to understand how it's working, you got to pay pretty good attention on a consistent basis. You can't assume that what it was is what it's going to be.
no, or, you know, there's, even it can get it out of balance very easily. There, you know, certainly there's the counter-reactive loop. What I'm saying is that there are patterns, and those patterns represent networks, and they represent certainly loops and feedback loops and links. You can start talking about them in the language of some kind of mapping and graphics. That's the only way you can really take a look at the holistic. You can't linearly, even the best writer couldn't explain some of these things and see why they're happening and how they're happening, because many of them are below, are certainly at least counterintuitive in terms of it. I mean, even when we make the statement of to have some sustainability in this world, we have to use half of what we're using in raw material. And the toxics that we produce in the process of using raw materials. Well, the reality is that even if we went and stabilized that half, the carbon in the atmosphere would continue growing.
Yeah. So
And you can only explain that by a feedback loop.
Yeah,
and showing its reaction.
Yeah, the carbon release is maybe in a runaway mode now. In fact, I think most people say that it is because the warming will release more gas from the ground, which will blah, blah, blah. It'll keep going up even if we drastically cut.
Mm-hmm.
And so what are we going to have to do? Adapt to that. But if we don't
And are we going to adapt to it
to adapt to?
Are we going to adapt to that by using our linear brain or using our nonlinear brain or mindset?
Well, if you say you got to reduce by half, I don't consider that absolutely linear thinking because there's a lot of nuance in that. Some things might increase, but total, you got to stop using so much energy. One of my contentions is if we just had infinite energy and it didn't put CO2 in the air, maybe we could be stupid enough to screw up an awful lot of the rest of the world before we figured the rest of it out.
Well, how does nature use energy?
It uses enough of it to keep things alive. It doesn't need, what's nature? It's a bunch of life. The ecology is. And any given organism in it may be incredibly efficient in obtaining or using energy. Something captures almost any little sliver of energy that's available anywhere for life. So it's very good at it. So how do we get along on a little less energy? How does the ecology get along on a little less energy? I'm convinced that up to a point it would get along okay. It would change, it would modify, it would evolve, but it'd keep going. real question is, can the level of consumption we now have continue with it? In other words, are we screwing up nature somewhere close to the point of some kind of collapse that's really bad?
Well, can you understand the relationships, the actions you take, okay, and bring together both the nonlinear way of looking at the world, at reality, and the linear way, and create some kind of a synergy between those? You're going to have that trouble because we're polarized still in the mechanistic view of the world, in how we solve problems and how we, even the consumption is based on that. We need more, and we can keep getting more by just keep churning out and digging deeper and being more efficient.
Oh, yeah. Well, the economic system drives us to do that. It's based on things growing. And if you change that, you're turning a lot of basic thinking upside down. Sometimes you'd call it economic thinking, but maybe it's instinctive. Even old indigenous people instinctively wanted to grow the tribe. They couldn't because they had to accept the limits of how they could feed and how they could adapt. And they didn't have anywhere near the technical capability that we have today. So they didn't affect nature very much. So if they didn't bother nature very much, it didn't bother them all that much. A great example is the population of this little Alaskan village, Kivalina. It's grown 4 times in 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they acquired enough stuff that now the little spit of land on which they live is about to be eroded by the sea, and they can't afford to move themselves. 100 years ago, they'd put it all in Umiaks and paddled away, and that'd been that. Wouldn't have thought a second thing about it.
Well, maybe it's were they, our whole mindset from the right up from the beginning of mankind, the Greeks, and so right into the Middle Ages, man saw himself as part of nature and responded as such, and understood the interdependency with it. Mr. Newton and came along and defined it in a different way, that nature and everything out there, along with Galileo, were machines. And if you look at the world as a machine, you don't see the relationship anymore. And if you look at the way to come up with your thesis in a laboratory, which means really basically keep it small, your observations, scientific observations, you're hiding yourself from the external world and limiting the variables. Mm-hmm. Yes, you can explain gravity if you're in a tube, that vacuum tube with all the air out. You've eliminated every external factor from it to try to explain it. Now you come up with a pretty good thesis. Now we've lived with that kind of mentality right through the Renaissance, right into today.
Oh, it still affects science. A lot of experiments are little fragments, and they exclude an awful lot of variables that ought to be considered, or at least make people dubious about the comprehensive nature of anything you just discovered. One of my favorites is that drinking red wine will do what? Reduce probability of some heart condition. I don't know whether that's true or not. I don't know what those studies were. I don't know what the backgrounds of people were, but struck me that people drinking red wine probably a little different in many other ways from the ones that don't. Mm-hmm. And so if you were to take a bigger view of it, Uh, we could say we intervene in systems and see what happens. If you do little lab experiments, mouse experiments, you always got the problem of whether or not this will extrapolate to other animals or to humans. Or is the model the same? Is it different? How is it different? And on into the night. And if you're doing, let's say, some kind of drug research, you don't really know until this thing is out in the field, and a lot of people have taken it, what variation you have in human physiology and maybe psychology that will cause a bum reaction on the part of at least some people. It's kind of like what's causing all the peanut allergies. We're not all the same. I'm not peanut allergic. Most people aren't. But what is it that would make some people that way? And
well, there's the factor of the way we communicate is the other factor. I don't think we really have examined how we all individually see reality, whether you're a scientist or you're a farmer.
mm-hmm.
And that's till we get to the point where we are not dependent on the one man to change the perspective of reality, like a Newton or like an Aristotle, and depend on the individual, till we get to the point where we can collectively understand the different viewpoints.
Yeah, well, maybe we are beyond that point today, that there are very few things where some great brainy hero is going to say, aha, this is the answer. And that goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago. In this kind of a world, how do you begin to develop a concept that we are part of nature, it's part of us, and we got to work together with it instead of fighting it so much?
Well, deep down in our being, we know that.
Yeah.
Deep down, way down here, we know that. And we know we're part of the species. And to that degree, maybe it's the belief that we're so individual that forces us to start thinking about accumulating things. And how much can we own? Well,
yeah.
It's nice seeing the people of our age look around and say, maybe we got to get rid of some of this stuff.
Yes. And if you go back to ancient ag societies, or maybe even some that weren't, if things were going well, what did they want to do? Build a monument of some kind to their own glory and proficiency. Mm-hmm. So somebody else would remember it.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of human vanity in this.
Well, maybe it's not as human. Maybe that's a mutation of humanity rather than the true part of humanity. I mean, I think you see, we project a lot of our own traits onto the world. The cruel world and the fears that we have. We're not very sophisticated yet on how we think and how we communicate meaning. Probably the biggest disaster is communication between people.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot on that. In fact, I'm just reviewing a book or two now for a newsletter in which the thesis is that nearly all human communication is just transfer of symbolic meaning, that it's very hard for anybody to penetrate that and see anything much beyond just switching from one set of symbols to another or planting another symbol into the pattern I already see. And you start going down that path and you're kind of deep into the philosophical mush, but there's something there. How do you communicate this, or is it some kind of a feeling that you don't really communicate well symbolically?
Well, I think we can become very abstract. And by the nature is, the better we're educated, the more abstract we are in trying to be general about a topic when the real world is very concrete.
Yeah.
And the basic elements of it.
Oh, yeah.
And the subtleties of it.
You go way out, like with these principles of compression thinking, they're abstractions. What do people want? Well, tell me what I do, like right now, that's different. What's a little different rule for living or making a decision or whatever. And that's pretty hard to do because I think it varies a lot depending on who you are, where you are, and what's going on.
Yeah, the situation and the context.
Yeah.
We don't think very well in context. We right now, or we don't communicate very much in context.
Yeah. I tell you, Jack, we've been at this for a while. Can we conclude with something that these principles of compression thinking largely boil down to being much more systematic in how we regard nature and having some emotional appreciation that it's part of us and we're part of it?
I would agree with that, but I would agree with that provided we created a better grammar to talk about it. And I use the word grammar in a broad sense. Yes, we can talk about it in measuring things and weighing things, but then we have to face the reality that a system is not the sum of its parts, it's the relationships of its parts. And how do you represent that?
Yeah, how do we
You can't measure it, you can't weigh it. So I think we have to do is that in almost anything we present the linear aspect of it, which is measuring it, going through basically to stay in tune with the people that have that same mindset, either explicitly or implicit in their thinking, and add on at least some streamlined mapping or graphing of what we're talking about to represent the relationships and the networking.
Yeah, how does this relate to everything else in some great whole? Yeah, maybe we can stop there and resume this some other time. We've been going for quite a while now.